qualitative research can contribute to philosophical discussion and debate, and he will consider and tell us how we might establish more integrated qualitative philosophical research programs. So just as soon as we've quit the music, I'm going to hand over to Anthony to deliver this really interesting presentation. So thank you, Anthony.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm glad I wasn't the only one hearing music. I thought I was slowly losing my mind. And thanks so much to the organizers for the invitation to speak. It's been great being here the last few days and getting to see so much interesting research, especially on methodological issues and methodological challenges in doing good qualitative research. So I've been told that I'm allowed to pace around, which I like to do when I talk. Plus, I also get to hold this microphone and this, so I know what to do with my hands, because otherwise they just flail around awkwardly. But we'll see how this goes. Okay, everyone can hear me okay? Great. So thank you again for being here at the end of a long 3 days. Before I jump into this, I'll give you a little bit of background on where I'm coming from and what I'm going to talk about, because I think that even at a conference like this that is extremely interdisciplinary, I've met people working in healthcare and social sciences and education, there's still a sense in which I'm a bit of an outsider because my background is in philosophy, and in philosophy, you're not even trained to do any empirical research. So all of my more empirical stuff has kind of been self-taught and trying to work and collaborate with people from a wide variety of disciplines. But my philosophical background is in phenomenology. So I did scholarship on Heidegger and Husserl and Merleau-Ponty and all of those old texts. But what I was really interested in here was how phenomenology has been picked up and used by researchers in so many other disciplines. In pretty much every social science discipline, as well as lots of the psychological sciences, health sciences, art and design, pretty much all of those fields have some strand of phenomenological research. And how they use phenomenology differs often quite a bit from field to field. And it's really interesting to see what phenomenology has become in all of these different fields. So that's what I've focused on. And I started doing this work with psychiatrists and with clinical psychologists and figuring out the best ways that we can use insights from philosophical phenomenology to better understand experiences of mental illness and to inform psychiatric classification and diagnostic procedures and so on. And in the last few years, I started working in other areas, primarily in nursing, especially neurological nursing and the study of complex illness experience, and figuring out how we can use phenomenology to do better qualitative research, more effective qualitative research in the health sciences. And that's led to additional collaborations with people in anthropology and organization studies. And I've now somehow ended up in the Department of Sports Science and Clinical Biomechanics. I don't know how sports work, so that's been a bit of a challenge, but it's working out so far. I also still don't really know what biomechanics is. But I work there in a group, a small research group called Movement, Culture, and Society. That's an interdisciplinary group with people trained in sports science and anthropology and philosophy. And we all work to some degree on how best to use phenomenology to do qualitative research. And we're trying to come up with innovative ways of using phenomenology. So I think with all of that being said, what I'm hoping to do here is, in a sense, the opposite of what I've typically been talking about the last few years. I've mostly been talking to audiences of philosophers who are interested in doing empirical work, interested in doing qualitative work, and talking to them about how they can begin to take steps in that direction, either to work collaboratively or to train themselves or get training to do this kind of work. And now I'm speaking to a group of people on the other side, those of you who are already trained in qualitative research methods and already do qualitative work and have a lot of expertise in doing this kind of work. So I figured there's no reason to talk to you about how to do that work. Instead, we'll think about things in the other direction. How is it that the kind of work that you're doing might influence or inform philosophy? And I'll get to why I think you should be interested in that in just a minute, because it might not be obvious. Okay, so I'll go through this in 3 parts. I'll start off with what I take to be the standard view of the relationship between philosophy and qualitative research. And I think this standard view is actually a bit dated. So what I actually want to do is kind of, in a sense, bring you up to speed on what's going on in philosophy today Because I think that if you're just reading historical texts and you get a sense of philosophy, reading the history of philosophy, even up to the 1950s, 60s, I think you'll get a very different view of what's going on in philosophy that isn't quite accurate. And I think actually a lot of philosophers are beginning to encroach on a domain that we typically consider to be the domain of qualitative researchers and social scientists. And I think that's going to open up an interesting space for collaboration. And then I'll turn to this question of how we can use qualitative research to advance philosophical thought. And I'll give some examples of some research that's being done by some of my collaborators. It's two people who I've been working with in the development of qualitative methodologies, one from a background in psychology and one from nursing. So you'll get a different perspectives on how we might do this kind of research. Okay, so let's start off with this standard view. How do we typically think about the relationship between philosophy and qualitative research? I think we typically understand philosophy as a discipline that's concerned primarily, if not exclusively, with universal or essential insights. Right? If you look back at the origins of Western philosophy in ancient Athens, we have philosophers asking questions like, what is beauty? What does it mean to know? What is a good life? And if an ancient Athenian philosopher asked you, what is beauty? And you responded by saying, oh, I find that thing beautiful or that person beautiful, there's a sense in which you'd misunderstand what they're asking. Even if you gave them a pretty detailed and comprehensive account of how Athenians understood beauty or what Athenians found beautiful, there's still a sense in which that wouldn't quite be the answer they're looking for, right? If I said, well, Athenians really like symmetry or Athenians really like color, there's a sense in which that might be interesting from an anthropological perspective or a sociological perspective or historical perspective, but it's still not quite getting at what it is that philosophers are after, right? A good philosophical answer to one of these questions is an answer that's supposed to be true in all times and all places. We're not supposed to be saying something about some particular population or some particular group or some period of time. We're supposed to be getting at the essence of something that's always the case. And if it turns out that the answer you give isn't true in all times and all places, we consider that to be a bad philosophical answer, which is also fine, because if there's one thing philosophers are really bad at, it's answering questions. We're really good at asking them, but we've been asking the same questions for 2,000 years now. Okay, so if that's what philosophy is, then it might actually seem like qualitative research is completely at odds with philosophy, that qualitative research goes in the completely opposite direction. Because for the most part, qualitative researchers are really interested in particular populations. They're very sensitive to issues of situation and context. And sometimes you'll study something that's quite general. You might study cultural practices that belong to maybe an entire country, but often a lot of qualitative research is very, very local. You might want to understand, how does this particular group of people in this hospital experience having this treatment? And there might not even be the goal of generalizing beyond that. Your goal might be to understand what it's like for this particular group and people who share a lot of common characteristics. So if that's what qualitative researchers are doing, then what is this relationship between qualitative research and philosophy, right? Because it seems like they're going in two completely opposing directions, so much so that it might seem like they really have nothing to say to each other. But I think the standard view of this relationship is that philosophy provides theory or theoretical foundations. And I will say that philosophers will rarely refer to what they do as theory. I think philosophy becomes theory when it gets taken up in another field, right? It becomes theory when you're trying to use it to do something else. But for the most part, at least within qualitative research, we can say that philosophy provides theoretical foundations. And this is in the social sciences, the health sciences, whichever area you're looking at. So we draw on this philosophical theory, and then we use that to establish what we might consider to be our ontology, or epistemology, or even a whole methodology, depending on what kind of philosophical tools you're drawing on or philosophical traditions you're drawing on. And there's a lot of different ones that we appeal to here. Right? There might be some, like phenomenology, where people sometimes try to adapt wholesale methods from this philosophical tradition and then figure out ways to use them in qualitative research. There might be others, traditions like post-structuralism or social constructivism, that might instead provide a kind of view of your basic ontology, where you say, I don't assume everything is kind of objective and real, but things are constructed by the practices we engage in, drawing on the work of people like Foucault and other social constructivists. So there's a lot of different ways this gets used, but I think in general we can say what philosophy, the role philosophy traditionally plays in qualitative research is to in some way inform or ground theory. Now, that presentation suggests that we just have a one-way street. Philosophy informs qualitative research, but if philosophers are just interested in these things that are very essential and universal, then it seems like philosophers just aren't really going to care what's going on in qualitative research, right? That doesn't somehow reciprocally inform what it is that they're doing. And I don't think that has to be the case, but I think that is quite a common view. And I think it's still the case that a lot of philosophers aren't that interested in qualitative research, although I think they would be if they looked more closely at what's going on in a lot of these cases. So I think that we can actually create a kind of two-way dynamic here, where qualitative research is also informing philosophy in really constructive and productive ways. But when I say this, it's not because I think that qualitative researchers should start trying to answer these kind of fundamental philosophical questions about, say, the nature of the universe or the fundamental features of human existence. I don't necessarily think qualitative researchers should have that kind of demand, and I don't think you necessarily have that kind of interest or need to have that kind of interest. Instead, I think that if we look at what's really going on in philosophy today, and just in the last few decades, really, we'll see that philosophers, a lot of them aren't really asking those basic questions anymore. A lot of them find those questions really boring, and they finally decided that after 2,500 years, we can ask some new questions. So a lot of them are encroaching, I think, on a space that we would typically think of as belonging to qualitative research, belonging to the social sciences, belonging to the health sciences, and so on. And I think because philosophers are already taking these steps and engaging with these kinds of questions and topics, there's a point of convergence, but we still need to do some work to figure out how best to construct this point or work within this area of overlap. Okay, so what is this state of philosophy today? What is philosophy actually like if it's not a bunch of Athenians in togas walking around asking what the good life is? So we do still have some philosophers who are engaged in this project of trying to answer kind of grand speculative metaphysical questions about, why is there something rather than nothing? We still have people asking that question. It's not like we completely stopped. But we also have a lot of philosophers who are now really interested in what I'd call human contingency, particularity, and difference. So a few traditions that we might see this in philosophy, especially in feminist philosophy, for instance, we see a lot of philosophers who are interested specifically in questions not of human existence in general, but of women's experience. So we have philosophers asking questions like, what is the nature of feminine shame? And how does feminine shame differ from masculine shame? Or how do women experience their own bodies? And how does feminine experience of a body differ from a traditionally masculine experience of a body? Or in philosophy of race, we have philosophers asking questions like, what is the experience of being a visible racial or ethnic minority in, say, North America or in Europe? And how does that shape your experience of your body? And what are some of the issues that arise there? Or in philosophy of illness, we have people asking questions like, how does your experience of time change when you're diagnosed with a terminal illness? Right? How does your orientation toward your past and future change in a situation like that? Or how does your experience of your own bodily capacities change when you're diagnosed with a chronic illness? And these are beginning to look a bit like the kinds of questions that some qualitative researchers are asking, even if they're still fairly broad, fairly general, maybe not quite as local as we often see in certain qualitative traditions. We're beginning to see some points of convergence and some points of overlap. Now, I do want to stress that this work I'm talking about, this isn't work that's just on the fringes of philosophy. I think maybe in the 1970s, 80s, maybe even into the 90s, quite a bit of this would be a bit fringe in philosophy. We had a few people doing this, but they weren't necessarily looked upon in particularly high regard. But that is not the case today. There are plenty of jobs coming up. I mean, there's not that many jobs in philosophy in general, but of the jobs there are plenty of jobs coming up in things like philosophy of race or feminist philosophy. And there's now widespread views that we need more and more people working on these topics. And there are a lot of philosophers, especially PhD students and very early career scholars, who are interested in these kinds of topics and asking these kinds of questions. And quite a few of them are coming to the point where they're recognizing that in order to answer the questions they're asking, they can't use purely philosophical tools. They have to supplement the work they're doing, either by finding good empirical work that they can draw upon, or sometimes by doing that kind of empirical work themselves or collaboratively with others. So there is a lot of interest in doing this kind of work. I think, to give you one example, I just came here from one place that we might think of as a very, very traditional philosophical center. Just on Monday and Tuesday, I was helping to run a workshop at the Husserl Archives in Cologne, where we might expect there's a bunch of people sitting in a cold, dark basement, reading 100-year-old manuscripts written by Husserl and trying to figure out what he was talking about. And you have some of those people there who are doing that. But the reason I was there is because we were bringing two research groups together. One, the group that I'm with in Denmark, that's mostly qualitative researchers, and the group of philosophers at the Husserl Archives in Cologne, because those philosophers are starting to ask questions where they realize they can't answer them using just the philosophical tools they have. There are a couple of them there who are doing some really interesting work on the phenomenology of dementia experience. And they're getting to the point where they're saying, well, we've probably done just about all of the kind of philosophical and conceptual work we can do to better understand dementia experience. And it's getting to the point where I have to go out and I've got to do some observations and I have to ask some questions, and I don't know how to do that, but I know that I have to do that. So there's this point of overlap where we have a lot of philosophers who are interested in doing this kind of work and want to start working with qualitative researchers. And this isn't just phenomenology. I'm just using those examples because that's the area I'm most familiar with. So since they don't have the tools available to them to do what we might think of as traditional qualitative research, they're often just relying on kind of anecdotes from their own experience. Sometimes they draw on memoirs, sometimes they draw on literature, and they're often not too sensitive to issues of bias and some of the issues of methodology in doing this kind of work, right? They'll reflect a lot on their own experience without ever having read a methodological text about, say, autoethnography. So there's a lot that philosophers can still learn at this point. But what I want to focus on here is that what they tend to be doing is that they're using particular experiences, maybe their own, maybe someone else's, and they're trying to develop or derive more general concepts. And what happens in this case, when they derive or develop one of these general concepts, is that it doesn't just help them make sense of this one case. If they do a good job in developing this concept, then it can be taken up by other philosophers and also other researchers in a lot of other disciplines to help make sense of experiences there as well. So I'm just going to give you one example of what this looks like in philosophy before I turn to some of the more empirical work. So I'll use the example of Javi Carroll's work on the experience of chronic illness. And Javi Carroll's a philosopher at Bristol in the UK. And she's drawn a lot on her own experience of living with a chronic illness and has written quite a few philosophical texts on this now. And one concept she's come up with that seems to have been kind of widely influential and has caught on quite quickly is what she calls bodily doubt. So she points out that in kind of everyday experience, at least if you're healthy and able-bodied, we tend to operate with what she calls a sense of bodily certainty. This isn't an explicit belief of what my body can do. It's just that when I walk into this room, I have a sense that I can walk to the other side of the room, that I can sit on this chair. When I see a set of stairs, I just perceive them as the kind of thing I can walk up or walk down. I perceive my meal as something I can digest. I just have a general sense of what my body can and can't do. And for the most part, I feel fairly secure and certain in my body's capacities. And she points out, drawing on her own experience, that often what happens in cases of chronic illness is that that kind of tacit sense of certainty becomes disrupted. And you now start to explicitly reflect upon your own body. Your body might become an object for you. You also might start reflecting on, say, your sense of time. So things that you used to do without thinking, like just going to the grocery store and grabbing a few things to make for dinner, you now might have to plan out that entire trip of making sure there's somewhere you can stop on the way because you'll be out of breath and so on. So she points out that lots of things that were tacit in the case of illness start to become explicit. Your body is an object. The world around you has to be much more structured. And in fleshing out this concept of bodily doubt, she's used this in her own case, in her own philosophical work, but it's been taken up in other areas as well, right? So this isn't just a concept that makes sense of her experience. And in fact, it's not just a concept that only makes sense of chronic illness. So there's already some work coming out that uses the same concept to help make sense of social anxiety, of how people doubt their ability to kind of normally engage in a regular conversation or to successfully engage in a conversation. Now we can use this sense of doubt to understand that. I'm also now using it in collaboration with some of the researchers in my own department of sports scientists and rehabilitation therapists, pain researchers, to think about how we can adapt this concept to use it to better understand experiences of chronic pain. So one reason I think you might want to be interested in this kind of work, in engaging with philosophers and doing this kind of concept development, is that if you can help develop one of these concepts, yes, in a sense, you're just kind of immediately contributing to philosophy, but secondarily, you're potentially contributing to a wide range of other fields if you develop concepts that are useful, that help us understand important aspects of human experience and human existence. Okay, so what does that actually look like? How do we go about doing this kind of empirical work that can reinform these concepts and then potentially provide theory that can be used in other areas? So I'll take you through two examples here. And again, one example is from psychology, one example is from nursing. And both of these people, Alan Koester and Marianne Klinke, they're both people I'm collaborating with in the development of philosophical and qualitative methodology that we call phenomenologically grounded qualitative research. And I won't go into too much detail about that. There's other stuff written about it if you're interested in it. But the kind of key feature of it, at least when contrasted with some of the other popular phenomenological approaches to doing qualitative research, is that for the most part, we don't draw on methods that were developed by the philosophers. Instead, what we're interested in are the particular concepts they developed, concepts of embodiment, concepts of lived time, concepts of selfhood, and so on, and the distinctions they draw between these and among these. And figuring out how best to use those concepts in the design of a qualitative study. So typically when you use this approach and you do a qualitative study, it's a very focused study. It's not that explorative. You've often done a huge amount of background research and are often an expert on a particular topic or particular area. And you've identified specific gaps in knowledge that we want to fill. And then we use these concepts to keep the study quite focused all the way from the very start in the way that we formulate the questions, the way that we conduct the interviews, the way that we analyze the data. So I'll start with Alan Koester's study. So Alan is a qualitative researcher, background in philosophy and psychology. He works at the Danish National Center for Grief in Copenhagen, which is an NGO. He does qualitative research for them. And a few years ago, Alan did this study of early parental bereavement, study of people who lost a parent when they were a young child. And when he developed the interview guide and did the study, he focused on a few different features of experience that he had identified as potential gaps in what we currently know. He looked at lived time, he looked at experiences of embodiments, and he also looked at kind of background feelings, what we might call moods or existential feelings, ways of being attuned to the world. So when he did this work, at first, I mean, the aim was primarily to understand grief. And he wasn't asking people to describe their experiences of the moment of loss. He wasn't asking them to redescribe their experiences of in their childhood. He was interviewing people who were adults, often decades after the loss of their parent. And he wanted to know, how has your experience still been shaped by that loss? How has your general disposition toward the world altered, if it has at all? And one thing he found, and this wasn't something that he necessarily anticipated, but because he was asking questions both about how people's experience of time has shifted and also how their experiences of their body have altered and changed, a lot of people started talking about what we call body memory. So much the same way that we can kind of recall an event that happened to us or recall something that someone said to us, we also have memories of kind of what it felt like to be held by someone or to hold someone, what someone smelled like, and so on. These very sensory memories. And he found that there was actually an interesting distinction between people who lost a parent at different ages. So if you were very, very young, just a few years old when you lost a parent, it seemed like for the most part, you didn't really have body memory of your parents. Whereas if you were older, say, 8, 9, 10 years old, then what those people described is longing for very specific things about their parents that they remembered. They might long for the particular way it felt when their father picked them up, or the particular way their mother's hair smelled. But when he then interviewed those people who were much younger when they lost their parent, they engaged in very different kinds of behavior. They would often do things like look at photos of their parents a lot, or watch videos of their lost parents, or ask their other parent to describe the lost parent to them. And ultimately, he argues that what they were describing was not so much a longing for specific things about their parents, but a longing for having a concrete sense of their parent at all. And he calls it longing for concreteness. And he says this is a fundamentally different kind of body memory, a different kind of longing that we find in these two cases. So ultimately, this can help us better understand not only the experiences of grief, which might be helpful for informing, for instance, psychotherapy and so on, but it also helps us better understand what we mean by body memory in the first place. Perhaps might even inform understanding developmental phases of body memory. When do we actually start maintaining body memories or creating body memories? Right? So this engages in a certain kind of concept development that can then be taken up and used in other fields, perhaps in experimental sciences, but also in philosophy and qualitative research and so on. Now, Marianne Klinke, she's a professor of neurological nursing at the University of Iceland. And she worked for many years as a nurse before becoming a professor, and she specializes in the treatment of stroke patients, and specifically hemispatial neglect. So hemispatial neglect is a really complex experience, a complex condition. It's a bit difficult to describe, but often what you find there is if someone has hemispatial neglect after a stroke, and it happens quite commonly after a stroke, if you, for instance, serve someone a plate of food, they'll eat all the food on one side of the plate. They don't even recognize there's anything on the other side of the plate. They put on their makeup on one side of their face, they get dressed on one side. So they may have paralysis on one side of their body, but they don't recognize that they're paralyzed on one side of their body. So one issue with this is that these people have no real insight and they confabulate. If you ask them questions, they have no recognition that there's anything wrong with them at all, which creates very dangerous situations because they'll do things like get up and try to walk out of bed and fall over because the left side of their body is paralyzed. So she thinks that we need to have a much better understanding of what their experience is actually like. And if we have a much better understanding, that can inform not just everyday treatment of how a nurse, for instance, is going to interact with them, but might also inform rehabilitation therapy programs and so on. So she didn't know quite how to study this experience because it's so complex. There's so much there that you get from the confabulations of the people you're interviewing or observing them or what their friends and family say to you. So she decided she had to do a very focused study. And to prepare for this, she went to the Center for Subjectivity Research, the philosophical phenomenology center in Copenhagen. And she spent about 6 months there, reading a lot of philosophical texts, talking a lot with philosophers and preparing for this study. And she picked a few concepts that she thought would be key based on her own experience and the current literature. So she picked the concepts of body schema, body image, and affordance. And I'm just going to focus on the concept of affordance here and how that was used in her work. So when we talk about affordances, that's a concept that comes from phenomenology and from Gibsonian psychology. But essentially the idea is quite simple. Just as when I'm here perceiving the world around me, I'm not perceiving a bunch of brute objects that I then assign with meaning. I don't just perceive something and say, oh, that's a chair. A chair is the kind of thing I can sit on. I just perceive things as what they afford, right? A pen affords writing, a chair affords sitting, stairs afford walking up and getting to the next floor. That's just generally how we perceive the world, as things that afford or do not afford certain kinds of possibilities for us. And she said, it seems like there might be some kind of disorder of affordance that's happening in cases of hemispatial neglect. So that was one thing she focused on when she did her observations and when she talked to friends and family about someone's behavior. And she used this in the way that she analyzed her data as well. And ultimately, she argued that actually we should understand cases of neglect as involving what she calls pathological affordances, that the world seems to afford possibilities for you that you don't actually have based on your bodily capacities, right? So typically, if someone had, say, left side paralysis and it didn't involve neglect, you would very quickly adapt to what you can and can't do. The world would stop, right? Stairs would stop affording the possibility of walking up and you wouldn't try to walk up the stairs. But that's not the case with a neglect patient. They would still try to do that. They don't perceive these things as not affording possibilities. They perceive the world as affording all of the same possibilities it afforded to them before they had a stroke. And they keep behaving as if it affords those possibilities. So in this case, she's also doing a bit of concept development, coining this notion of pathological affordances, which can again be taken up and used not only in understanding cases in healthcare, but also in doing further qualitative research, perhaps doing experimental research, informing philosophical debates, and so on. So this is another case of, I think, interesting theory development. So if that's what we can do, if that's how we can use qualitative research potentially to re-inform philosophical concepts that then become theory to be used in a variety of fields, where do we go from here? What are the kind of challenges we're facing now? Well, I think there's really, I'm sure there's plenty of other challenges, but there's two main challenges I'll focus on here just briefly, and this is how I'll close. One is a very practical question. How do we actually find collaborators to do this kind of work? I don't know that I have a clear answer to that question. I can say that things are changing very, very quickly in one sense, that philosophers are very quickly recognizing that they need to do this kind of empirical work. They're becoming more interested in this. And quite a few philosophers are now willing to at least get some basic training in qualitative methods, maybe not so that they can do work themselves, but so that they can have an informed conversation with a qualitative researcher and work with them to design and carry out a study. So we're doing a bit of this work at Southern Denmark. We run a PhD course every summer that's an intensive PhD course on integrating phenomenology with qualitative methods. We teach some of our master's students this. We're running a fellowship program to bring philosophers in to develop projects on this kind of area. But there are other people doing this as well. This isn't something that's just happening with us. There's widespread interest in this. And I think there's also a growing interest, especially among qualitative researchers who consider themselves to be phenomenologists or to use phenomenology in some way. More and more of them are becoming interested in what's going on in philosophy today as well, and engaging with philosophically trained phenomenologists. And there's been some really productive conversations that have opened up in this space. So I think there is the beginnings of a space for finding these kinds of collaborators, but it is still a difficult thing to do. But I think it will rapidly become easier, and we'll find more and more people who have the right amount of expertise to at least begin a conversation in a productive way. And then second, how do we find the right methods? I think that's also a difficulty, because not all qualitative methods are going to give us these kinds of insights that might reinform theory in the particular way that I discussed. And that's okay, right? That shouldn't necessarily be a goal of all qualitative research. But I think it tends to work best when you use these kinds of quite focused methodologies, where you limit the scope of your study and you're allowed to explore something in considerable depth. I think that often when we do something that's a bit more exploratory and we have a lot of breadth in what we get, it's hard to have enough detail in some of the phenomena to figure out whether it conflicts with or informs a certain concept. So what we've typically done that's been somewhat successful, I think, is often using these more exploratory approaches at the very start, perhaps doing short-term ethnographic field work, helping to identify a problem. But then when you really go in and do the interviews, before doing that, you then do a lot of this, what we call kind of front-loaded work, where you bring a lot of these concepts in, you anticipate the concepts that you think will be useful in the study, you design these interview guides in that way. And I know there's other qualitative approaches that work broadly in this way. It's not just the stuff that I'm working on here, but I think that there's also a kind of new proliferation of qualitative methods that are engaging with philosophy in these ways. There's been some interesting special issues that have just come out in a few journals on topics like this. And this includes both qualitative researchers becoming more philosophical and philosophers becoming more empirical. And I think we'll soon have a lot more interesting tools to do this kind of work. Oh, thank you very much.